Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today, we're going to make some wall-mounted bike racks. For the last few years, our bikes have lived here in the shop, and that means I have to clean them off every time we use them. And since we have recently reclaimed our spare room, I thought it'd be a good idea to move the bikes in there. It'd keep the bikes clean and it would give me more space here in the shop. They take up a lot of space just standing there, so I thought of wall mounting them would be a good idea. And I did a little research to see what other people are using and came up with this plan. I'm going to add a couple of links to videos I looked at. One was probably the first one I saw, and the other one is pretty much the exact plans that I had for this one. So let's take a look and see how this comes together.
To start this project, I began with some 4/4 red oak and milled the pieces to size. I explained the process I use in detail in a recent video, and I'll add a link to that below. For now, we'll just speed through the process. I start by cross-cutting the stock an inch or so long at the miter saw. Then I plane one side smooth at the planer with a piece of MDF and some hot melt glue. Then the other side is planed parallel, and then down to its final thickness. Next, one edge is cut square at the table saw with my straight edge jig. While I'm still at the table saw, the second edge is cut to the final width. The last step is to cut one end square at the miter saw. With the stock prepared, I can begin the detail work for this build. I start by tilting my table saw blade to 25 degrees. A magnetic angle finder is great for work like this, especially on smaller saws. It can take a bit of fussing, but I can set my blade at pretty much any angle between 90 and 45. Using my miter gauge at the table saw, I can cut the 25-degree angle on the top piece. If you're wondering about the angle on the stock before I made the cut, it's because I cut a much too shallow angle the first time around. While the saw was still set up, I cut one edge of the front piece to 25 degrees as well. After some careful measurements, I came back and cut the second edge of the front piece, again at 25 degrees. Not only do you have to make sure the measurement is correct, but the direction of the angle as well. I'm going to cut out the center portion of the front piece, leaving two 1-inch wide legs. An easy way to get clean edges here is to use the table saw. By raising the blade as high as possible, you can get close to your stopping point since the blade is nearly perpendicular at the lead edge. Just work carefully. I marked my stock with a stopping point. Then I transferred that pencil mark onto the fence and ran the stock until the two marks lined up. I just stopped the saw, pulled the stock out, reset the fence, and then cut the other leg. Just remember which side of your reference line you want the blade on to keep it inside the waist area. I used my bandsaw to cut the half round at the top of the front piece. A jigsaw or coping saw would work here as well. Again, make sure to stay just inside your line. You can clean up your saw marks with a file, sandpaper, or a sanding drum. I use a sanding drum in the drill press with an auxiliary table, which helps keep my sides square to the face of the stock. A few minutes is all it took to clean things up. The base piece also has a cutout, but since it's in the middle of the stock, I'm going to go with a different technique. To start, I drill a couple of holes inside the area I'm cutting out using a Forstner bit. Those holes give me a place to start my jigsaw, and I use that to cut out the shape. Again, I stay close to my line, keeping my blade on the waist side. While I could use my jigsaw on the front profile, the bandsaw leaves a nicer cut, so I'll use that to shape the end. Now I go back to the drill press and sand the cuts I just made in the bottom piece. The only difference here is that to sand the middle of the stock, I need to adjust the table height, set the drum inside the piece, and then raise the table back into position. Moving on to the top, I cut the square end at the miter saw. I measured from the angle cut I made earlier to get the correct length. The top and bottom both need holes to accept the pipe that we'll use as a pivot point. I carefully laid out the location of the hole, set up my fence and stop, and then drilled both pieces with a 1-inch Forstner bit. I tested the hole size with a piece of decorative black pipe to make sure it would fit. I knew some of the inside areas would be inaccessible after assembly, so I decided to round them over now. I put a 1/4-inch roundover bit in my palm router and eased all the interior edges. I may have gone a bit further than I wanted, but in the end I can say any excess roundovers are just a design detail. I decided to assemble the rack one joint at a time. The first joint I tackled was the front to the top. With the 25-degree angles, there's no good way to clamp things. I thought I might try my pin nailer, but opted for blue tape instead. A bead of glue and a few strips of tape, and the assembly was set aside to dry. The key here is to keep the joint tight and the edges of the mating faces in line with each other. Once the glue dried, I strengthened the joint with some dowels. I came back with a 1/4-inch brad point bit in my drill guide that I had set to 25 degrees, and I set my depth for about 2 inches. I cut some 1/4-inch oak dowels to 2.5 inches and beveled their ends. I put a little glue on each one and drove them home with my mallet. The excess glue was wiped off, and I cut off the excess dowel with a flush cutting saw. I clamped the back to the bottom with a square clamp, and then set the front and top assembly on the bottom. After ensuring the bottom and top pieces were both level, I used the underside of the top to mark the final height of the back piece, before cutting it to size at the miter saw. If you've been around the channel for a while, you might be curious why I'm working on the top of my table saw and not using my work table as I usually do. Well, it's summer in Florida and most afternoons look like this. I could have used more dowels to connect the back to the top and the bottom, but I didn't think the back would be noticeable, so I opted for pocket holes. 2 on either end should do the trick. Before gluing things up, I added some blue tape on the inside to minimize the mess for any squeeze out, since I always sand the interior of my pieces before assembly. The two pieces were clamped together so that they were square, and the outer edges were in line before driving in 2 1.25-inch fine pocket hole screws. The top was added the same way, except I used a couple of F-style clamps to hold things in place, and then the tape could be removed and the assembly set aside to dry. I used a couple of clamps to help hold the angled legs of the front piece in position and laid out the center point so I could pre-drill for some number 8 screws. I had left my drill guide set at 25 degrees just for this purpose. I put a countersink bit in the chuck and adjusted my depth stop. I pre-drilled each leg to make sure that the head of the screw would sit below the surface of the bottom piece. More blue tape to minimize cleanup, and then I could add glue to the angled legs before I fastened them in place with some 2-inch screws. After letting that set up for a bit, I came back with my palm router and the same roundover bit to clean up the rest of the edges. I don't want any sharp edges on these racks since theoretically they'll be handled a lot. I made a block for the rear tire to rest against when the bikes are hung up. Since they're not structural, I figured 1 screw should be enough to hold them in place. The catch is the blocks are deeper than my countersink bits. So I came back with a 3/8-inch Forstner bit to get the countersink to the depth I wanted, leaving about 1 inch of stock below that. I didn't have a twist bit long enough for the pilot hole, so I dug out my set of 12-inch long brad points and used an 1/8-inch bit for the through hole. I gave these a round over at my router table since they're a little too small to try to safely work with my palm router. Then the racks and the blocks got a good sanding at 120 and then 150 grit to get them ready for finishing. While I was test fitting to determine the length of the pipe, I realized that the 1-inch holes I had drilled were a bit undersized. Apparently the decorative pipe was a bit smaller than the standard black pipe. I used a sanding drum in my drill and worked the area until the pipe slid easily through the hole. I cut the 3/4-inch black pipe to length. You could use a hacksaw, a pipe cutter, or an angle grinder. Each rack will need one piece at 25 inches and two at 3 inches. I also use my grinder to remove any burrs from the cutting process. Just remember, if you use a grinder, that pipe's going to get hot. I found some decorative fittings at the big box store that don't need threaded ends on the pipe, and this makes assembly much easier. You can finish these racks with the finish of your choice. I like to spray 2 coats of water-based urethane, lightly sand everything with 220 paper, and then add 1 more coat. I also sprayed the black pipe, well, black. While the fittings look nice, the pipe can be a bit rustic. I gave all the pipes a few coats of spray paint, and the fittings just got 1 coat, just so they'd match. These racks need to be fastened to a stud, but I'm not a fan of stud finders, especially on walls like these that have plaster and lath. Plan B was to use a stack of rare earth magnets to locate the fasteners in the wall. I used my laser level to lay out the location of the stud so I could mount the first flange. I'd done a bit of figuring and determined the height of the lower flange. I drove in 2 2-inch screws to secure the flange to the stud. I connected 2 elbows and 2 3-inch nipples to one of the long pipes, set one end into the flange, and then I set the upper flange in place and marked the fastener locations along that laser line. Then I could set the pipe assembly aside and fasten the upper flange in place. After installing the pipe assembly through the rack, I set it into the flanges and locked it in place with an Allen wrench. Then I just had to test it out to see how my bike fit. After installing the second rack, I added the rear tire blocks. They're fastened to the same stud, and the height is just about the center of the rear tire. This keeps the bike closer to perpendicular and saves wear and tear on the walls as the bikes pivot.
If you don't count the time for glue drying and the finishing process, I probably only have a couple of hours invested in these racks. Since these are going to live in our spare room, I wanted them to look as nice as possible. All the quarter rounds and the sanding and the finishing may not be necessary if you're going to mount these in your garage, but again, I thought it was a nice touch. Although I'm not sure they're going to end up in our spare room once we rebuild the house. If you'd like to build these bike racks for yourself, I'll have a set of plans available shortly, and I'll add a link to that below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this video. Is there something I could have done differently, easier, smarter? Drop in the comments below. I'd also love to know what kind of bike racks you're using, and is it something you made yourself or something you purchased? Speaking of purchase, down below I've got a list of tools and materials I've used on this video, and some of them have affiliate links, so if you need one of those items and you purchase it through the link, it does help keep the channel going. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with your friends. If you haven't already, maybe hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. I'm never sure what's coming up next, but it should be interesting. So until then, have a great day, stay safe, and take care. And stay cool. It is hot in Florida.